على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. First and foremost, I advise myself to observe taqwa, to be more mindful and conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I advise all of you to do the same. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase our knowledge and our understanding of His deen so that we may live the truth more fully and more joyfully. In this first sermon, I'll be focusing on the issue of harmonizing our personal devotion to Allah with our connection to those around us, with our connections to our family members, to our close friends, our community members, and our society at large. And this is an important topic because often in our daily lives we'll see a tension between these two. A tension between, on the one hand, our direct connection to Allah, and on the other hand, our connection to those around us. And as a result of that tension, we tend to incline towards one extreme or the other, one tendency or the other. On the one hand, you have those who focus very much on their salats, on their fasting, on the purity of their food and drink and the way they dress. And that is all well and good. Those are things that we should be concerned about. But they may do so to such an extent that they neglect those social commitments, those responsibilities towards their family members, towards their friends, towards our community, towards society at large. And this is a tendency which I would call the monastic tendency. We see this in our community, and we also see this in the broader society. An extreme example of this in the broader society is the institution of monasticism, which is encouraged in certain religions like traditional Christianity and Buddhism, where people known as monks will actually take vows of poverty, and they will live lives of relative isolation from the rest of society. They will forgo marriage and those sort of things. And they think that this will actually bring them closer to Allah. It's not that they condemn the pursuit of wealth or that they condemn socializing, but they see these things as distractions from getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is one tendency which we should be careful to avoid. On the other extreme, I would say the more prevalent extreme in our society is what I would call the humanistic tendency. And that is the tendency for people in our community to focus very much on their social commitments, on their responsibilities towards their family members, towards their community, towards society at large. They might be very involved in social justice projects and charitable projects, but that same attention or the proper amount of attention is not given towards their personal devotion to Allah. There isn't as much devotion given to salat, to fasting, to the purity of their food and drink and the way they dress. And an extreme example of that, which we see in our society, is this whole phenomenon of social justice warriors. Right? So these are people, mainly young people found on college campuses and high schools, who are known for being, who are so focused on changing the world, and they are so focused on social and political issues that that's all they're known for doing. So they get the title social justice warriors. And perhaps if you were to go to one of these people and you were to tell them that before you change the world, perhaps you should cultivate your own soul, perhaps you should focus on your relationship with your Creator, they may give you a reply along the lines of, well, if they believe in God, well, God doesn't really care about those sort of things. What God really cares about is not your fasting and your prayer and your ritual purity or any of these things. What He really cares about is helping your fellow human beings and making the world a better place. That's what he really cares about. So this is a response you'll probably get from one of these type of people. And so this is another extreme which we should be careful to avoid. Please recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now the reason why it's important for us to avoid these extremes is because these extremes, these two tendencies, the monastic tendency on one hand and what I would call the humanistic tendency on the other hand, these are representations of deviations, of going astray from the sunnah of Rasulullah and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. The sunnah of the Prophet and the sunnah of the Imams is one of an ideal balance between these two extremes, between focusing too much on our personal devotion on the one hand and on the other hand our social commitments. The Prophet and the Imams held these things in a perfect balance in a way that was most pleasing to Allah. Rasulullah, as we all know, was a man of dua. He would make dua very regularly throughout his day. He would get up quite often for Salatul Layl. He had a strict regimen of fasting outside the month of Ramadan. And yet this same Prophet, who was given the unique blessing of the Mi'raj, his ascension to the heavens, while he was in this earth, this same Prophet was a man of jihad, a man of struggle. He was the leader of a large household with many wives and children. He was not just the spiritual leader of the ummah, but he was a political leader of the ummah. He was a judge for the ummah. And likewise, we see that with Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Amir al-Mu'mineen was a man of great tafakkur, of deep contemplation and meditation upon the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the heavens and the earth. And we see this all throughout, for example, Nahj al-Balagha. And yet this same Amir al-Mu'mineen was the Khalifa of the Muslim world at one time. This same Amir al-Mu'mineen, there was no hero like him, as we say. There was no hero like him on the battlefield. And there was no sword like his sword, Dhul Fiqar. And we see that reflected, that legacy of balance between personal devotion and social commitment reflected in the lives of all of our Imams. Please recite a salawat. Now the two tendencies, the two extremes that I explained earlier, the monastic tendency on one hand, where we overemphasize personal devotion to the exclusion of social commitments, and on the other hand, the tendency to exclude personal devotion for the sake of social commitments, these two extremes are not new. They existed during the time of the Prophet and during the time of the open presence of the Imams. And the Prophet and the Imams spoke very strongly against these tendencies. To give just a few examples, during the very lifetime of Rasulullah, some of his companions, some of the very early Muslims, thought it would be a good idea to fast on a daily basis and stay up all night in prayer and worship. And they would refuse eating meat, they would refuse wearing perfume, and they think that this would bring them closer to Allah. And in doing so, they neglected their social commitments, specifically their responsibilities towards their family members. And so as a result of this behavior, one of the wives of the Prophet, Salama, comes to him, and it's narrated in one of our hadith that she comes to him, and she tells him about this affair, what's going on with some of these companions. And it's narrated that Rasulullah became very angry, and he went to the masjid, he went to the minbar, and he said that he told everybody that I eat meat, I wear perfume, I don't fast every day, I do sleep during the night, and this is my sunnah, and whoever dislikes my sunnah is not from me. So the Prophet had a very strong response against this behavior during his own lifetime, a very strong response towards what I would call this monastic tendency. And similarly, we see in the lives of the later Imams, specifically from the time of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq onwards, alayhi salam, These imams lived under very harsh circumstances. Very oppressive regimes were in power during that time. First the Umayyi regime and later the Abbasi regime. And unsurprisingly, among the Alawis and the Fatimis, the descendants of Imam Ali and Lady Fatima alayhim as-salam, there is a tendency towards uprisings against these oppressive regimes. There is a tendency towards revolt. And you'll notice that our imams did not engage in these, our later imams did not engage in these revolts and these rebellions because they did not think it was the right time. For them, the priority was to preserve and transmit the knowledge of Ahlul Bayt, the authentic knowledge of Islam. And so some of the companions would come to the imams and they would question them about this. In one hadith, it's narrated that a companion came to Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, and he told them about a man, perhaps an Alawi, a descendant of Imam Ali, who was leading an uprising against the reigning regime. They didn't mention who the man was or who the regime was in the hadith. And he asked Imam Sadiq whether he should join that revolt. And Imam Sadiq replied that that man that you are referring to, and this does not apply to all rebellions or all revolts, but in this specific case, that man that you are talking about, he might be fighting for a just cause. But if that man were to come to power, he would be immediately opposed to us, the Ahlul Bayt. And he would be just as oppressive, if not more oppressive, than the regime that he's fighting against. So here, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, one way to look at this hadith would be that he is pushing back against the social justice warriors of his time. He is pushing back against this humanistic tendency where we focus very much on the social and political commitments of our time, but at the cost of our devotion to Allah and our devotion to the Prophet and the Imams. The danger, of course, is that if we do that, we may not be at a level of spiritual and ethical maturity to handle the changes that may come from our actions. And so the Imam is giving us a warning here not to fall into that trap. Please recite a salawat. So then the next question is, how do we, believers, come closer to that balance? How do we come closer to that ideal balance, that sunnah that was represented by the Prophet and the Imams? One way to approach this question is in principle, and another one is in terms of practice. In the next khutbah, inshallah, I'll talk about more practical ways that we can arrive at this sunnah, arrive at this ideal balance. But in the remaining part of this khutbah, I'll just be focusing on the principle. One way that we can come closer to this ideal is by looking at the relationship between shukr and iman, and having a deeper understanding of what it means to have shukr to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we look at the ayat of the Quran, we'll see there's a very intimate relationship between these two concepts, between shukr to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and having iman or faithfulness, having that faithfulness to Allah. In fact, they're so closely intertwined that that at times it seems that He will use iman and shukr interchangeably when contrasting it with kufr, with disbelief. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ يَتَبَدَّلَ الْكُفْرَ بِالْإِيمَانِ فَقَدْ ضَلَّ سَوَاءَ السَّبِيلِ. That whoever exchanges iman, faithfulness, in return for kufr, for disbelief, he has gone far away from the straight path. So here we see iman, faithfulness to Allah, being contrasted with kufr, with disbelief. But in another ayah, Allah says, إِنَّا هَدَيْنَاهُ السَّبِيلَ إِمَّا شَاكِرًا وَإِمَّا كَفُورًا. That we have guided him, the human being, on the path, on the straight path. Either he is grateful or he is not grateful. He either has gratitude, shukr, or he is in a state of kufr. So here, it is iman, it is shukr which is being contrasted with kufr. Now, shukr here does not just mean thanking Allah with the tongue. True gratitude is reflected in our actions. You can have, and this is something I don't think is uncommon in our society, but you'll often see kids who show a great deal of gratitude to their parents for the sacrifices they've made to them in words, right, by saying thank you. But a lot of those same kids, if they were asked to, a lot of those same children, if they were asked to make sacrifices for their parents or to reprioritize their commitments in their life for the sake of their parents, they would say no. It's my life, it's how I want to live it. And so the shukr that we may see around us is often a superficial kind of gratitude. True gratitude is not just done by the tongue, but by the actions. And so that's something to keep in mind when we talk about the relationship between shukr and iman. Now there is a beautiful hadith from our fourth Imam, Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin, alayhi salam, where he says that on Yawm al-Qiyamah, Allah will bring forth a man, one of his servants, and he will tell him, why were you not grateful to me? Why were you not grateful to me? And this man will reply that, Allah will ask this man, why are you not grateful to so-and-so, to fulan, to some anonymous individual? And this man will reply that I was grateful to you. I might not have been grateful to him, but I was grateful to you. And then Allah will reply that you were not grateful to me. That whoever shows gratitude to me shows gratitude to an-nas, to humankind. And so from this hadith we can derive the principle that in reality there is no tension between our personal devotion to Allah on the one hand and our social commitments. In reality, our social commitments are only valuable as a means to connecting to Allah. Our social commitments are commitments to our family members, to our friends, to our community members, to society at large. These should not be seen as a distraction from getting closer to Allah. Rather, these are a means of getting closer to Allah. When we think of these things as a distraction, that is a misconception on our part. On the other hand, as we see from this hadith, if we think that personal devotion to Allah alone will get us closer to Him, even when we neglect our social commitments, that is not the case. That personal devotion is not of much value when it is not coupled with social commitment. And so inshallah, in the next khutbah, I'll be focusing more on practical ways to come closer to that ideal that's represented by the sunnah of the Prophet and the Imams, which is one of a balance between our social commitments and our personal devotions. Please recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد والثناء لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين. السلام على رسول الله، السلام على علي أمير المؤمنين، السلام على فاطمة سيدتي نساء العالمين، السلام على الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة، السلام على علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي. السلام على الحجة بن الحسن القائم المهدي صلوات الله عليهم أجمعين. Once again, respected ulama, brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Once again, I advise myself to observe taqwa, to be more conscious and mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I advise all of you to do the same. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase our knowledge of His deen and deepen our understanding of His deen so that we may live the truth more fully. So in the previous sermon, I had discussed the need to harmonize our connection to Allah, which is a direct connection, to our connection with other people, which is an indirect kind of connection to Allah. The need to harmonize our personal devotion with our social commitments. And that in reality, in principle, there is no tension between these two. One is just a way of connecting to Allah directly through personal devotion, through salat and saum, and through a ritual purity. And the other is just an indirect way of connecting to Allah through our relationships with our family and our community members and society at large. So at this point, I would invite all of you to engage in what is called by our ulama muraqabah, to engage in a spiritual and a moral introspection. Ask ourselves, which extreme do we tend to lean towards? Do we find ourselves focusing heavily on personal devotion and neglecting at the cost of our social commitments? Do we tend towards what I would call the monastic tendency? Or do we find ourselves leaning heavily towards social commitments and perhaps neglecting our ibadah? Perhaps just doing the bare minimum of our personal devotion to Allah, or na'udhu billah, even falling below that bare minimum. This is something that we should do on a regular basis if we want to strive towards that sunnah, towards that ideal balance that was represented by Rasulullah and the Imams. So for those who tend to find themselves on what I would call the monastic extreme, where they tend to be more withdrawn and focused on their ibadah and their personal relationship with Allah, I would advise them to come out of their shell more, to come out of their comfort zone, and take advantage of opportunities to meet and gather with other mu'mineen, especially now that the weather is getting better. There will be more opportunities to invite people to our homes, to respond to the invitations of other mu'mineen, more weddings. And so mu'mineen who find themselves in this situation where they find themselves a bit more withdrawn, they should prioritize those opportunities of gathering with fellow believers. Those who tend to find themselves on the other extreme, which I think is the more prevalent extreme, where we tend to focus very much on our social commitments and tend to neglect our personal devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are now coming at the end of the month of Rajab. Soon we'll be entering into the month of Sha'ban, and then inshallah the month of Ramadan will be upon us. And so this is really a special season of ibadah. This is a time where there are many opportunities to engage in additional virtuous actions like mustahab prayers, mustahab du'as, mustahab fasts. And this should be a wake-up call to us to both increase the quantity of our ibadah, but more importantly, the quality of it, by focusing more on these acts of worship and making it a priority to recite Quran on a regular basis and not just waiting until the first of the month of Ramadan. So in conclusion, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive all the believers, myself and all the believers present, for our sins and our shortcomings, that He forgive all believers all throughout the world, especially our noble ulama and our shuhada among them. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance, the manifestation of the Imam al-Zaman alayhi salam, so that he may fill the earth with tawheed and justice and rid it of shirk and oppression. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد